A scream pierces the night at the grand Seaside Hotel, where Miss Jane Marple arrives for a quiet retreat. When the glamorous Mrs. Laurent is found poisoned, suspicion falls on a cast of secretive guests: a brooding artist, a blustering colonel, a gossiping spinster, and a desperate hotel owner. As clues unravel, a hidden letter, a discarded coat, a second near-fatal poisoning, Miss Marple's keen eye untangles a web of greed, love, and betrayal. In a race against a cunning killer, only she can reveal the truth before another tragedy strikes. Chapter 1. The Arrival at St. Mary's Bay. The train from London swayed gently as it hugged the rugged coastline, its rhythmic clatter blending with the distant cry of gulls. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her small, neat figure wrapped in a tweed coat, her hands folded over a worn leather handbag. Through her spectacles, she studied the unfolding vista of St. Mary's Bay, the slate-grey sea flecked with foam, the cliffs rising sharply against a sky heavy with autumn clouds. Her old friend, Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy, had been insistent in her letter. A week at the Seaside Hotel would be just the thing to restore Jane's spirits after a tiresome bout of rheumatism. Miss Marple, though sceptical of seaside cures, had agreed, partly for Elspeth's sake and partly because the promise of quiet observation in new surroundings was never unwelcome. As the train slowed, the platform of St. Mary's Bay came into view, bustling with porters and passengers. Miss Marple alighted with care, her sharp blue eyes catching a peculiar moment. A young porter, burdened with luggage, paused to glance furtively at a man in a dark overcoat who lingered near the station exit. The man turned away swiftly, his face obscured, and melted into the crowd. Miss Marple filed the image away, her mind attuned to such fleeting oddities, as she was met by a driver from the Seaside Hotel. The car wound up a steep road to the hotel, a grand Edwardian edifice of red brick and white trim, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes over the cliff's edge. The hotel's lobby was a study in faded elegance: polished oak panelling, chandeliers that flickered with the sea breeze, and a carpet worn thin by years of well-heeled guests. Mr. Percival Fortescue, the proprietor, greeted Miss Marple with a practised smile, though his pale face and restless fingers suggested a man under strain. "A pleasure to have you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, but his eyes darting to the bustling staff. He introduced her to the other guests already gathered: Colonel Reginald Bantry, a ruddy-faced retired officer with a booming voice and a perpetual frown at the modern age; Miss Lydia Prescott, a thin, sharp-featured woman whose eyes gleamed with the promise of gossip; Mr. Felix Warrender, a young artist with tousled hair and a disarming smile; and Mrs. Vivienne Laurent, a striking widow whose silk dress and diamond earrings spoke of wealth, though her guarded expression hinted at secrets. Mrs. McGillicuddy, bustling in with her usual exuberance, enveloped Miss Marple in a warm embrace. "Jane, you'll adore it here. The air, the views, oh, and the people. Such an interesting lot." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her attention caught by the way Felix Warrender's gaze lingered on Mrs. Laurent, who studiously ignored him. Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, was already grumbling to Mr. Fortescue about the lack of decent whisky in the bar, while Miss Prescott whispered to a nearby guest about Mrs. Laurent's rumoured fortune. The atmosphere was lively, yet Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent, like a faint discord in a well-rehearsed symphony. That evening, the dining room was aglow with candlelight, the long table set with crisp linen and silver. Miss Marple, seated between Mrs. McGillicuddy and Miss Prescott, observed her fellow guests over her soup. Colonel Bantry held forth on the decline of military discipline, his voice carrying over the clink of cutlery. Felix Warrender sketched idly on a napkin, his eyes flicking to Mrs. Laurent, who conversed softly with Mr. Fortescue about the hotel's history. Miss Prescott leaned toward Miss Marple, her voice a conspiratorial hiss. "That Mrs. Laurent," she murmured. "They say she inherited millions from her husband, but no one knows how he made it. Shady business, if you ask me." Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind noting the malice in Miss Prescott's tone and the way Mrs. Laurent's hand tightened on her glass. As coffee was served, Mr. Fortescue rose to welcome the guests, his speech polished but strained, as if reciting lines he no longer believed. Miss Marple's gaze wandered to the staff. A young maid, Elsie, moved nervously among the tables, her hands trembling as she poured. When Elsie passed Felix, he dropped his spoon with a clatter, and their eyes met briefly before she hurried away. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her coffee cup. It was a small thing, yet small things, she knew, often unravelled the tightest knots. As the guests dispersed to the lounge or their rooms, she lingered, her serene expression masking a mind already sifting through the day's impressions. St. Mary's Bay, she sensed, held more than bracing air and scenic views. Trouble, quiet but unmistakable, was stirring beneath the Seaside Hotel's polished surface. Chapter 2. The Scream in the Night. The Seaside Hotel, bathed in the silver glow of a gibbous moon, stood silent save for the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her modest room on the second floor, had retired early, her knitting laid aside on the bedside table. The sea air, as Mrs. McGillicuddy had promised, was indeed bracing, but it was the undercurrents of human behaviour at dinner that kept Miss Marple's mind alert, her light sleep punctuated by the occasional creak of the old building. At precisely 10 minutes to midnight, a sound shattered the stillness, a scream, sharp and raw, that seemed to pierce the very walls of the hotel. Miss Marple sat up, her heart steady despite the jolt. She slipped her feet into her sensible slippers, donned her woolen dressing gown, and reached for her spectacles. The scream had been unmistakably feminine, and its intensity suggested not mere fright, but mortal terror. She opened her door and peered into the dimly lit corridor, where gas lamps flickered, casting long shadows. Other doors were opening, and voices, some alarmed, some querulous, began to fill the air. Colonel Bantry, his nightshirt tucked hastily into trousers, emerged from his room, his face flushed with indignation. "What the devil was that?" he bellowed, striding toward the source of the noise, which seemed to come from the east wing. Miss Lydia Prescott appeared next, her hair in curling papers, clutching a shawl about her thin shoulders. "It's murder, I tell you," she declared, her voice shrill with excitement rather than fear. Mr. Felix Warrender, his shirt unbuttoned and his hair dishevelled, hovered at the edge of the group, his eyes wide but curiously guarded. Mrs. McGillicuddy, bustling from her room, caught Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, did you hear? It came from Mrs. Laurent's room. I'm sure of it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm, but her mind racing, cataloguing the reactions of those around her. Colonel Bantry, taking charge as if on a battlefield, pounded on Mrs. Vivian Laurent's door. "Mrs. Laurent, are you all right?" There was no answer, only an eerie silence that seemed to deepen the chill in the air. The other guests gathered, a small crowd of anxious faces illuminated by the flickering lamps. Mr. Percival Fortescue, the hotel's proprietor, hurried up the stairs, his face pale, and his dressing gown askew. "What's happened?" he demanded, his voice tight with something that might have been fear or exasperation. When no response came from within, he fumbled in his pocket for a master key, his hands trembling slightly. "Stand back," he said, though his authority wavered. The lock clicked, and the door swung open to reveal a scene that froze the onlookers. Mrs. Vivienne Laurent lay sprawled across her four-poster bed, her silk nightgown tangled about her limbs, her face contorted in a grimace of agony, her dark hair, usually so elegantly coiffed, fanned across the pillow, and her eyes, wide open, stared unseeing at the ceiling. A faint, acrid scent hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the back of the group, recognized it at once. The bitter almond-like odour of cyanide. Colonel Bantry, his military instincts overriding his shock, stepped forward and touched her wrist. "She's dead," he said gruffly, his voice betraying a tremor. Miss Prescott gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Felix Warrender turned away, his face pale and his hands clenched. Mrs. McGillicuddy clutched Miss Marple's arm, whispering, "Oh, Jane, how dreadful." Miss Marple said nothing, her eyes moving from the body to the room's details. A silver tray on the bedside table, holding a cup of cocoa, half drunk, a window slightly ajar, letting in the sea breeze, and a small, overturned vial near the bed, its contents long since spilled. Mr. Fortescue, his composure fraying, ordered the staff to fetch Dr. Haydock, the local physician, and to telephone the police. "No one is to touch anything," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The guests, murmuring among themselves, retreated to the corridor, where the air felt less oppressive. Miss Marple lingered, her gaze lingering on the cocoa cup. She noted its delicate porcelain, the faint stain of lipstick on the rim, and the slight residue in the bottom, darker than cocoa alone should be. Her mind, trained by years of observing human nature, began to weave a pattern from these threads, though it was still too early to see the whole design. Dr. Haydock, a stout man with a brisk manner, arrived within the hour, his medical bag in hand. He examined the body, his face growing grim. "Cyanide poisoning," he confirmed, his voice low. "Administered recently, likely through the cocoa. Death would have been swift, within minutes." He gestured to the vial, which he carefully lifted with a handkerchief. "This likely held the poison. The police will want to analyse it." Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively near the door, noted the doctor's care and the way Mr. Fortescue's eyes followed the vial, his lips tightening. By dawn, Inspector Craddock arrived from the county police, a young man with sharp eyes and a respectful demeanour. Miss Marple knew him from a previous case in St. Mary Mead, where her insights had proven invaluable. He greeted her with a nod, his expression suggesting he was not surprised to find her at the heart of another mystery. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I trust you've already noticed something I've missed." She smiled faintly, her hands folded over her handbag. "Only that people are rarely what they seem, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild, but her eyes keen. Craddock began his interviews in the hotel's drawing room, a grand space with heavy drapes and overstuffed armchairs. The guests, summoned one by one, offered little of substance. Colonel Bantry, blustering about the outrage of it all, claimed to have been asleep, though he admitted to hearing footsteps in the corridor around 11. Miss Prescott, relishing the drama, recounted seeing Mrs. Laurent at dinner, looking quite pale, as if she knew something dreadful was coming. Felix Warrender, questioned next, was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he spoke of retiring early to sketch by lamplight. "I heard nothing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, though his eyes darted to the door as if expecting an interruption. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner of the drawing room, listened as the maid, Elsie, was called. The girl, no more than 20, was pale and tearful, her apron twisted in her hands. She admitted to preparing Mrs. Laurent's cocoa, as she did every evening, but swore she had added nothing unusual. "I left it on the tray outside her door, as always," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know how it happened, sir, I swear." Craddock pressed her gently, but her fear was palpable, and she glanced nervously at Mr. Fortescue, who stood by the window, his back rigid. As the interviews continued, Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, a soothing counterpoint to the tension in the room. She noted the small inconsistencies. Colonel Bantry's mention of footsteps, which no one else corroborated, Felix's pallor, which seemed more than mere shock, and Elsie's fear, which went beyond the natural distress of a servant caught in a tragedy. Mrs. McGillicuddy, joining her friend for a cup of tea, whispered, "Jane, there's something queer about that maid. She looked ready to bolt when Mr. Fortescue passed her in the hall." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the vial. Cyanide was not a common household item, nor was it easily obtained. Someone in the hotel had planned this carefully. The morning wore on, and the guests, confined to the hotel pending further investigation, grew restless. Miss Prescott, never one to miss an opportunity for gossip, cornered Miss Marple in the lounge. "I heard from one of the chambermaids," she said, her eyes gleaming, "that Mrs. Laurent was seen arguing with a man in the garden yesterday evening. A tall fellow, in a dark coat. No one knows who he was." Miss Marple listened politely, her mind recalling the man at the station. "How interesting," she said, her tone encouraging but non-committal. She knew better than to trust gossip outright, but Miss Prescott's tale added another piece to the puzzle. Felix Warrender, meanwhile, had retreated to the cliff path, where Miss Marple observed him from the lounge window. He stood sketching, his pencil moving furiously over the paper, though his gaze often drifted to the hotel. His agitation was clear, even from a distance, and Miss Marple wondered what drove it. Was it grief, guilt, or fear? She recalled his brief exchange of glances with Elsie, and filed it away for later consideration. Colonel Bantry, pacing the lounge, muttered about the inefficiency of the police, though his bluster seemed to mask unease. "In my day," he said to no one in particular, "we'd have had the culprit in irons by now." Mr. Fortescue, ever the dutiful host, attempted to maintain order, but his strain was evident. He snapped at a waiter for a spilled tray, then apologised profusely, his hands fidgeting with his cufflinks. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the contrast between his polished exterior and his nervous demeanour. She thought of the hotel's faded grandeur, the whispers of financial trouble she had overheard at dinner. A man in debt, she knew, could be driven to desperate acts. As the afternoon drew on, Inspector Craddock shared a quiet word with Miss Marple. "The vial's been sent for analysis," he said, "but I suspect it'll confirm cyanide. The question is how it got into the cocoa, and who had access." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "You might consider, Inspector," she said, "who benefits from Mrs. Laurent's death, and who might have known her habits well enough to tamper with her evening drink." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her cryptic hints. "I'll look into her background," he said. "She was wealthy, that much is clear. Her late husband was a financier, but there are rumours of shady dealings." Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her mind sifting through the morning's events. The scream, the vial, the cocoa, the man in the dark coat, all were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. She thought of her village, St. Mary Mead, where human nature revealed itself in small, telling ways. A glance, a hesitation, a word out of place. Here, in the grand but troubled Seaside Hotel, the same patterns held true. Someone had planned a murder, and someone had miscalculated, leaving clues for those who knew where to look. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the hotel's lawns, Miss Marple rose and made her way to the garden, where the air was sharp with salt and the promise of answers. She paused by a rose bush, her fingers brushing the petals, and considered the guests. Colonel Bantry, with his bluster and hidden depths, Miss Prescott, whose gossip might conceal sharper observations, Felix, whose charm masked turmoil, and Mr. Fortescue, whose polished facade was cracking under pressure. And then there was Elsie, the frightened maid, whose role in the tragedy was yet to be unravelled. The scream in the night had set the stage, But the play, Miss Marple knew, was far from over. She returned to the hotel, her step light but purposeful, ready to watch and listen as the truth began to emerge from the shadows. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Suspicion. The morning after the scream, the Seaside Hotel was cloaked in an uneasy hush, as if the very walls held their breath. Miss Jane Marple sat in the lounge, her knitting needles clicking softly, a pale blue shawl taking shape in her lap. The guests, confined to the hotel by Inspector Craddock's orders, moved restlessly, their conversations stilted and their glances wary. The sun streamed through the tall windows, gilding the faded elegance of the room, but it did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that hung over the gathering. Inspector Craddock had set up a makeshift office in the hotel's library, a dimly lit room lined with leather-bound volumes that smelled of dust and disuse. He had spent the morning poring over Mrs. Vivienne Laurent's belongings, which revealed little beyond her wealth, a pearl necklace, a diamond-studded watch, and a locked diary with no key in sight. The police had traced her fortune to her late husband, a financier whose dealings, Craddock confided to Miss Marple, were murky at best, possibly tied to smuggling, or worse. Her will, found in a velvet-lined box, named a distant cousin as her sole heir, a man living in London who had no apparent connection to St. Mary's Bay. The cocoa cup, now in police custody, was being analysed, but Craddock suspected the cyanide had been slipped into it just before Elsie delivered the tray. Miss Marple, sipping tea with Mrs. McGillicuddy, listened as her friend recounted the morning's gossip. "That maid, Elsie, is beside herself," Mrs. McGillicuddy said, her eyes wide. "I saw her crying in the pantry, and when Mr. Fortescue walked by, she flinched as if he'd struck her." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Elsie's nervous demeanour during her interview. The girl's fear suggested more than the shock of a guest's death. It hinted at coercion or guilt. "People under pressure," Miss Marple remarked softly, "often betray themselves in small ways, Elspeth. A look, a gesture, it's all quite telling." The lounge was a hive of subdued activity. Colonel Bantry paced by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, muttering about the indignity of being treated like a suspect. "In my day," he said to anyone who would listen, "a gentleman's word was enough. Now we're all under the microscope." Miss Lydia Prescott, perched on a velvet settee, scribbled in a small notebook, her lips pursed as if savouring a scandal. When Miss Marple caught her eye, she leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple, about that man in the dark coat I mentioned. The chambermaid swears she saw him again last night, lurking near the service entrance. Could he be the killer?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles pausing. "It's possible, Miss Prescott, but we must be careful not to leap to conclusions. Appearances can be deceptive." She recalled the fleeting figure at the station, wondering if he was indeed the same man. Her thoughts were interrupted by Felix Warrender, who entered the lounge with his sketchbook under his arm. His face was drawn, his usual charm dimmed by a restless energy. He sat by the window, staring out at the cliffs, his pencil idle. Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped against the sketchbook's cover. He was, she thought, a young man carrying a burden. Determined to observe more closely, Miss Marple excused herself and took a turn about the hotel's grounds. The cliff path, winding along the edge of the sea, was deserted save for Felix, who had moved outside to sketch. She approached quietly, her footsteps muffled by the grass. "A fine view for an artist," she said, her tone gentle. Felix started, nearly dropping his pencil. "Oh, Miss Marple! Yes, the cliffs are inspiring." His smile was strained, and his sketch, a jagged outline of the rocks against a stormy sea, seemed to reflect a troubled mind. "You knew Mrs. Laurent, didn't you?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mild, but her eyes sharp. Felix hesitated, his fingers tightening on the sketchbook. "Only slightly," he said. "She admired my work in London, asked me to paint her portrait once, but it never came to anything." His words were careful, but his gaze flickered toward the hotel, as if watching for someone. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Art often captures what words cannot," she said, leaving him to his sketching. As she walked back, she considered his unease. A young man infatuated, perhaps, or entangled in something darker. Back in the lounge, Colonel Bantry's voice carried across the room as he confronted Mr. Fortescue near the bar. "Your accounts are a disgrace, sir," he said, his face red. "I heard you were in debt up to your ears. Hardly the mark of a proper host." Mr. Fortescue, usually so composed, flushed deeply. "My finances are my own concern, Colonel," he snapped, then softened, as if regretting the outburst. "The hotel is sound, I assure you." Miss Marple, seated nearby, noted the exchange. Debt, she knew, could drive a man to desperate measures, and Mr. Fortescue's polished exterior was beginning to crack. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock shared a discovery with Miss Marple. "We found a scrap of paper in Mrs. Laurent's room," he said, producing a torn note from his pocket. It read, in a hurried scrawl, "Meet me at 10. Urgent." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the ink matched a pen found in the hotel's writing desk. "It suggests she had a rendezvous," Craddock said. "But with whom?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "You might ask Elsie if she saw anyone near Mrs. Laurent's room last night," she suggested. "Servants often notice what guests overlook." Craddock nodded and summoned Elsie, who appeared more composed, but still pale. "I didn't see anyone, sir," she said, her voice low. "I left the cocoa at 10, as usual, and went to bed." But her eyes darted to Mr. Fortescue, who stood by the door, watching. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, observed the girl's hands twisting in her apron. Fear, she thought, or guilt, or perhaps both. She recalled a maid in St. Mary Mead, young and impressionable, who had been coerced into petty theft by a domineering employer. Elsie, she suspected, might be caught in a similar web. As evening approached, the guests gathered for dinner, though the atmosphere was strained. Miss Prescott whispered to Mrs. McGillicuddy about a rumour that Mrs. Laurent had been blackmailed, though she offered no proof. Colonel Bantry, subdued, spoke little, his eyes fixed on his plate. Felix, seated across from Miss Marple, picked at his food, his sketchbook beside him. Mr. Fortescue, presiding over the table, attempted levity, but his jokes fell flat, and his hands shook as he poured the wine. Miss Marple, eating sparingly, watched them all, her mind sifting through motives. Wealth, love, fear, revenge, each was a thread in the tapestry of murder, but which had been pulled to unravel Mrs. Laurent's life. After dinner, Miss Marple retired to the veranda, where the sea air was sharp and the stars glittered coldly. She thought of the note, the man in the dark coat, and Elsie's fear. Someone in the hotel had known Mrs. Laurent's habits, had access to cyanide, and had the nerve to act. She recalled a case in her village where a quiet gardener had poisoned a rival over a trivial slight. Human nature, she knew, was the same everywhere, whether in St. Mary Mead or St. Mary's Bay. As she returned to her room, her step was light, her mind alert. The shadow of suspicion was lengthening, and Miss Marple was determined to follow it to its source. Chapter 4. The Hidden Letters. The Seaside Hotel, on the third morning after Mrs. Laurent's death, seemed to settle into a deceptive calm, like the sea before a storm. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her knitting a soft rhythm against the murmur of the guests. The police presence, led by Inspector Craddock, had intensified, with constables discreetly searching the grounds and interviewing staff. Yet the answers remained elusive, and the guests' nerves frayed under the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, observe the subtle shifts in behavior, the way glances lingered, voices dropped, and hands fidgeted. Murder, she knew, had a way of peeling back the veneer of civility. The drawing room, with its heavy velvet curtains and polished mahogany, was a favourite haunt of the guests, a place where secrets might be overheard. Miss Marple chose a corner armchair, partly for its view of the room and partly for its proximity to the writing desk, where guests penned letters or left notes. As she knitted, her fingers deft and automatic, she watched Miss Lydia Prescott flit about, her notebook ever present, jotting observations with the zeal of a scandal sheet reporter. Colonel Bantry, meanwhile, sat by the fire, his newspaper unopened, his brow furrowed as if wrestling with an unspoken thought. Felix Warrender, sketching in a far corner, seemed lost in his work, though his pencil strokes were erratic, betraying agitation. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a cushioned settee near the window, where a faint glint caught her eye. Excusing herself to Mrs. McGillicuddy, who was lamenting the lack of fresh scones, she approached the settee and, with a casual air, adjusted the cushion. Beneath it, she found a crumpled letter, its edges torn as if hastily concealed. She unfolded it carefully, her heart quickening. The handwriting was bold, almost theatrical, and the words were stark. "Leave St. Mary's Bay before it's too late. You know why." No signature, no date, but the threat was unmistakable. Miss Marple slipped the letter into her handbag, resolving to share it with Inspector Craddock when the moment was right. For now, she preferred to observe, to let the letter's existence stir her thoughts like a stone dropped into a still pond. At luncheon, the atmosphere was strained, the clink of cutlery loud against the silence. Mr. Percival Fortescue, presiding over the table, announced that the hotel would remain open despite the tragedy, his voice striving for confidence but faltering. "We must carry on," he said, though his eyes avoided the guests, settling instead on the chandelier above. Miss Prescott, never one to miss an opportunity, leaned toward Miss Marple. "He's worried about money, you know," she whispered. "They say the hotel's on the brink of ruin. Mrs. Laurent's death hasn't helped. Guests are talking of leaving." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Fortescue's strained demeanour. A man in financial straits, she knew, might see a wealthy widow's death as an opportunity or a necessity. Felix Warrender, seated opposite, was quieter than usual, his food untouched. When Elsie, the maid, passed with a tray, he dropped his fork with a clatter, and their eyes met briefly before she hurried away. Miss Marple, sipping her soup, noted the exchange. Elsie's hands trembled, and her apron was twisted, a sign of nerves that went beyond the strain of recent events. Miss Marple recalled a young housemaid in St. Mary Mead, coerced into silence by a domineering employer. Was Elsie, she wondered, hiding something out of fear? After luncheon, Miss Marple took a turn in the hotel's rose garden, where the air was sharp with the scent of salt and blooms. She paused by a bench where Colonel Bantry sat, his pipe unlit, staring at the sea. "Dreadful business, this," he said as she approached, his voice gruff but lacking its usual bluster. "Never thought I'd see murder in a place like this." Miss Marple sat beside him, her knitting in her lap. "Tragedy finds its way everywhere, Colonel," she said gently, "but it often leaves clues, if one knows where to look." He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "You've a sharp mind, Miss Marple. Seen anything I've missed?" She smiled, her expression serene. "Only that people talk more freely when they think no one's listening. You mentioned footsteps the night Mrs. Laurent died. Did you hear anything else?" The Colonel frowned, his fingers tightening on his pipe. "Can't say I did. Just the usual creaks of an old building. But I'll tell you this. There's something off about that Fortescue fellow. Always fidgeting, like a man with a guilty conscience." Miss Marple nodded. filing away his words. The Colonel's bluster often hid a keen eye, and his suspicion of Fortescue aligned with her own. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple found Mrs. McGillicuddy in conversation with Miss Prescott, who was recounting a new rumour. "I heard from the gardener," Miss Prescott said, her voice low but eager, "that he saw a man in a dark coat near the service entrance last night, after the scream. Slipped away before anyone could catch him." Mrs. McGillicuddy gasped, but Miss Marple's mind turned to the letter in her handbag. The man in the dark coat was becoming a recurring figure, like a shadow cast by an unseen hand. She thought of the station, the porter's glance, and now this. Was he a guest, a stranger, or a ghost conjured by frightened imaginations? Inspector Craddock joined her later, his face tired but determined. "We've had no luck with the cocoa cup yet," he said, settling into a chair beside her. "The lab confirms cyanide, but no fingerprints beyond Elsie's and Mrs. Laurent's. The vial's a dead end too. Common glass. Could have come from anywhere." Miss Marple nodded, then drew the letter from her handbag. "You might find this of interest, Inspector," she said, handing it to him. Craddock's eyes widened as he read, his fingers tracing the bold script. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Under a cushion," she replied, her tone mild. "People are careless when they're frightened." Craddock studied the letter, his brow furrowing. "This changes things," he said. "A warning suggests someone knew Mrs. Laurent was in danger, or wanted her to think so." He paused, then added, "I've asked about the man in the dark coat. No one on staff admits to seeing him, but I don't trust their silence. Fortescue's got them all on edge." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "You might look at the hotel's guest register, Inspector," she suggested. "A name, a signature, could tell us more than nervous servants." Craddock nodded, making a note. "I'll do that, and I'll have this letter analysed for handwriting." As evening fell, the guests gathered in the lounge, where a fire crackled against the autumn chill. Felix Warrender, his sketchbook closed, sat alone, his eyes distant. Miss Marple approached, her manner grandmotherly, but her questions precise. "You seem troubled, Mr. Warrender," she said, settling beside him. "Is it the tragedy, or something more personal?" Felix started, his smile forced. "Just the shock, I suppose," he said. "Mrs. Laurent was kind to me. It's hard to believe she's gone." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes noting the flush in his cheeks. "Kindness can be a complicated thing," she said. "It often comes with expectations." Felix looked away, his fingers tightening on his sketchbook. Later, as the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her thoughts circling the letter. Its bold handwriting was unlike any she had seen among the guests, yet it felt deliberate, as if meant to be found. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a threatening letter had been a distraction, masking the true motive. Was this letter a warning, a taunt, or a ploy? And who was the man in the dark coat, slipping through the hotel's shadows? As she retired to her room, her knitting tucked under her arm, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening. The hidden letter was a clue, but it was only one piece of a larger pattern, waiting to be unravelled. Chapter 5. The Second Tragedy. The fourth morning at the Seaside Hotel dawned under a sky heavy with clouds, the sea churning restlessly below the cliffs. Miss Jane Marple, awake early, sat by her window, her knitting idle, as she watched the gulls wheel against the grey. The hotel, though still grand in its bones, felt diminished, its guests moving like shadows under the weight of Mrs. Laurent's murder. The discovery of the threatening letter had stirred new unease, and Miss Marple sensed that the killer, emboldened or desperate, might strike again. Her intuition, honed by years of quiet observation, was rarely wrong. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the dining room half empty as some guests avoided communal meals. Colonel Bantry, usually a fixture at the table, was absent, reportedly taking a walk to clear his head. Miss Lydia Prescott, her notebook tucked away, whispered to Mrs. McGillicuddy about the police's lack of progress, her tone more anxious than gleeful. Felix Warrender, pale and withdrawn, sipped coffee in silence, his sketchbook untouched. Mr. Percival Fortescue, ever the anxious host, hovered near the buffet, his smiles strained as he urged the guests to try the kippers. Miss Marple, eating sparingly, noted his forced cheer and the way his eyes darted to the staff, particularly Elsie, who moved with a hunted air. It was mid-morning when a commotion erupted from the kitchen. A piercing cry, followed by a clatter of pans, sent the guests rushing from the lounge. Miss Marple, her step unhurried but purposeful, followed, her handbag clutched tightly. In the pantry, a narrow room lined with shelves of preserves and china, they found Elsie crumpled on the floor, her face ashen, her breathing shallow. A small glass vial, identical to the one found in Mrs. Laurent's room, lay beside her, its cap loosened, and a faint whiff of bitter almonds in the air. A kitchen maid, trembling, stammered that she had found Elsie moments before, clutching the vial as if in a trance. Mr. Fortescue, pushing through the crowd, knelt beside her, his face a mask of concern. "Fetch Dr. Haydock," he barked, though his hands shook as he loosened Elsie's collar. Miss Marple, standing quietly at the edge of the group, noted the vial's position, too neatly placed, as if staged. Dr. Haydock arrived swiftly, his medical bag in hand, and administered a stimulant. Elsie stirred, her eyes fluttering open, but her words were incoherent. A jumble of, "He made me," and "I didn't mean to." The doctor, his brow furrowed, declared her stable but in need of rest. "She's had a shock," he said, "and possibly a small dose of poison, though not enough to kill." Inspector Craddock, summoned from the library, took charge, ordering the pantry sealed. The guests, ushered back to the lounge, buzzed with speculation. Miss Prescott, her voice sharp, declared, "She tried to kill herself, mark my words. Guilt over Mrs. Laurent's death." But Miss Marple, knitting in her corner, was unconvinced. Suicide, she knew, often left signs: despair, withdrawal, a finality of purpose. Elsie's fear seemed outward, directed at someone or something. Mrs. McGillicuddy, sitting beside her, whispered, "Jane, it's too much like the first murder. The same poison, the same vial. Could it be a coincidence?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Coincidences, Elspeth, are rarer than people think," she said softly. Craddock, after ensuring Elsie was moved to a quiet room under the doctor's care, sought Miss Marple's counsel. "This complicates things," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "If Elsie poisoned Mrs. Laurent, why attempt suicide now? And if she didn't, why was she targeted?" Miss Marple, her eyes thoughtful, suggested, "You might ask Elsie, when she's stronger, if she received any instructions or threats. She mentioned, 'He made me.' That implies coercion." Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "I'll speak to her, but I'm also looking into that man in the dark coat. The gardener's description matches Miss Prescott's, though no one's seen him since." Miss Marple, recalling the letter she had found, shared a quiet theory. "The vial beside Elsie," she said, "was too conveniently placed. Someone may have wanted it found, to cast suspicion on her, or to silence her." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think she was poisoned deliberately?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I think, Inspector, that someone in this hotel is very clever and very frightened." She suggested he check the guest register for any recent departures, particularly the mysterious John Blackwood, whose name had caught her eye the previous day. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Elsie in the small room where she rested, a constable posted outside. The girl, propped up on pillows, was pale but coherent, her eyes red from crying. Miss Marple, her manner gentle as a favourite aunt, sat beside her. "Elsie, my dear," she said, "you've had a terrible shock. But if you know something, anything, it's best to share it. Fear can be a heavy burden." Elsie's lip trembled, and after a moment, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a note, miss, slipped under my door 2 nights ago. It said to put something in Mrs. Laurent's cocoa, or they'd ruin my family. I burned it, I was so scared. But I swear, I didn't do it. I couldn't." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind racing. "Did you see who left the note?" she asked. Elsie shook her head, tears spilling. "No, miss, but it was his writing, bold, like he meant to scare me." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions deepening. The bold handwriting matched the warning letter she had found, suggesting a single hand behind both threats. But whose? She thanked Elsie and left, promising to speak to Craddock on her behalf. In the lounge, the guests were restless, their conversations fragmented. Colonel Bantry, returned from his walk, was quieter, his bluster replaced by a brooding intensity. When Miss Marple mentioned the man in the dark coat, he grunted. "Sounds like a coward, skulking about. If I'd seen him, I'd have had words." His tone, though gruff, held a note of unease, and Miss Marple wondered if his walks were more than mere exercise. Miss Prescott, meanwhile, cornered Felix Warrender, pressing him about his connection to Mrs. Laurent. "You were sweet on her, weren't you?" she said, her eyes gleaming. Felix flushed, muttering a denial before retreating to the veranda. Miss Marple followed, her step light, and found him sketching the cliffs, his lines sharp and chaotic. "You're troubled, Mr. Warrender," she said, her voice kind but probing. "Sometimes, sharing a burden lightens it." Felix's hand stilled, his eyes meeting hers. "I cared for her," he admitted, his voice low. "But it was nothing. Improper. She was kind, that's all." Miss Marple nodded, noting the tremor in his voice. A young man in love, she thought, could be vulnerable or dangerous. Craddock, returning from the village, shared a breakthrough. John Blackwood, the guest who left the morning after the murder, was spotted in a nearby town. "We're tracking him down. And his signature in the register. It's bold, like the letter you found." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Then you must find him, Inspector. He may be the key, or a distraction." She thought of the vial, the note, Elsie's fear. Someone was weaving a careful web, but webs, she knew, could be unravelled with patience. As evening fell, the hotel's atmosphere grew heavier, the guests avoiding each other's eyes. Miss Marple, knitting by the fire, reflected on the second tragedy. Elsie's survival was a stroke of luck, or a miscalculation. The killer, she sensed, was growing reckless, and recklessness left clues. In St. Mary Mead, a jealous wife had once poisoned a rival, only to betray herself with a careless word. Here, the pattern was different, but the human heart, greedy, fearful, vengeful, was the same. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, a quiet counterpoint to the storm brewing within the Seaside Hotel. Chapter 6. The Artist's Secret. The 5th day at the Seaside Hotel brought a restless energy, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the guests. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the lounge with her knitting, felt the tension like a taut thread, ready to snap. The second tragedy, Elsie's collapse in the pantry, had deepened the atmosphere of distrust, and whispers of poison and betrayal swirled among the guests. The police, led by Inspector Craddock, were combing the hotel for clues, but the killer remained elusive, a shadow moving just beyond reach. Miss Marple, her eyes keen behind her spectacles, knew that secrets, like stitches, could be unravelled with care. The morning was damp, a fine mist cloaking the cliffs and muting the sea's roar. Miss Marple, wrapped in her shawl, decided to take tea in the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with potted ferns and wicker chairs. It was a place where guests often sought solitude, and she hoped to observe Felix Warrender, whose agitation had grown since Elsie's incident. Felix, with his artist's sensitivity and guarded demeanour, intrigued her. His connection to Mrs. Laurent, however fleeting, hinted at depths yet unexplored. As she sipped her tea, Felix entered, his sketchbook tucked under his arm. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed, as if sleep had eluded him. He hesitated, then sat across from her, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Good morning, Mr. Warrender," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but inviting. "I trust the conservatory's quiet suits your work." Felix managed a faint smile. "It's peaceful," he said, though his tone suggested anything but peace. He opened his sketchbook, revealing a half-finished drawing of the cliffs, their jagged lines rendered with a feverish intensity. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, ventured a question. "You knew Mrs. Laurent well, I believe. She must have appreciated your talent." Felix's hand froze, his pencil hovering over the page. "Not well," he said quickly. "She commissioned a portrait in London last year. We met a few times, that's all." His words were measured, but his flush betrayed him. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression grandmotherly. "Art often brings people closer than they expect," she said. "It can reveal so much, joys, fears, even secrets." Felix looked at her, his eyes searching. For a moment she thought he might confess something, but he turned back to his sketch, his jaw tight. "She was, complicated," he said at last. "Kind, but guarded. I painted what I saw. Her strength, her sadness." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the word sadness. She recalled a young painter in St. Mary Mead, whose infatuation with a married woman had led to reckless acts. Was Felix, she wondered, caught in a similar tangle? Leaving him to his work, Miss Marple returned to the lounge, where Mrs. McGillicuddy was in animated conversation with Miss Lydia Prescott. "It's that artist," Miss Prescott declared, her voice low but sharp. "He's hiding something, mark my words. I saw him with Mrs. Laurent in London once, at a gallery. They were far too cosy for a mere commission." Mrs. McGillicuddy gasped, but Miss Marple, settling into her chair, remained silent, her needles resuming their rhythm. Gossip, she knew, was often a distorted mirror, but it could reflect fragments of truth. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock sought her out, his expression a mix of frustration and hope. "We've traced John Blackwood to a boarding house in the next town," he said. "He's agreed to come in for questioning tomorrow. His handwriting matches the letter you found, but I'm not convinced he's our man." "Too convenient, perhaps." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "A clever killer, Inspector, might leave clues to mislead. Have you spoken to Elsie again? Her fear suggests someone close, someone with power over her." Craddock sighed. "She's still shaken, but she insists she burned the note that threatened her. No new details, except that she's terrified of someone in the hotel. She won't say who." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Fear," she said softly, "is a powerful weapon. You might look at those who command loyalty, or inspire dread." Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her cryptic hints. "You're thinking of Fortescue, aren't you?" he said. "He's been jumpy, and the staff tiptoe around him." As if summoned, Mr. Percival Fortescue entered the lounge, his polished demeanour fraying at the edges. He announced a small gathering that evening, to lift spirits, though his smile was forced. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his hands fidgeted with his watch chain. She thought of the hotel's rumoured debts, the whispers of Mrs. Laurent's wealth. A desperate man, she knew, might see murder as a solution, but Fortescue's nervousness suggested fear as much as guilt. At the evening gathering, the guests assembled reluctantly, their faces strained under the chandelier's glow. Colonel Bantry, sipping whiskey, was quieter, his eyes fixed on Fortescue with a mix of disdain and curiosity. When the hotel owner attempted a toast to better days, Bantry interrupted, his voice sharp. Better days? With a murderer among us in your hotel falling apart? I heard you were begging Mrs. Laurent for a loan." The room fell silent, and Fortescue's face reddened. "That's slander, Colonel," he said, his voice trembling. "My affairs are in order." But his eyes darted to the door, as if seeking escape. Miss Prescott, seizing the moment, leaned toward Miss Marple. "I saw them, you know, Fortescue and Mrs. Laurent, arguing in the garden 2 nights before she died. Something about money, I'm sure." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the letter, the vial, Elsie's fear. The pieces were aligning, but the pattern was still incomplete. She glanced at Felix, who stood by the window, his sketchbook clutched like a shield. His eyes met hers briefly, and she saw a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, or desperation. Later, Miss Marple slipped into the conservatory, where Felix had left his sketchbook unattended. With a quick glance to ensure she was alone, she opened it, her fingers careful. Among the landscapes was a portrait of Mrs. Laurent, her face rendered with striking detail, her eyes wide, almost fearful, her lips parted as if in protest. The sketch was unfinished, but its intensity spoke of intimacy or obsession. Miss Marple closed the book, her mind racing. Felix's feelings for Mrs. Laurent were deeper than he admitted, but did they drive him to murder or make him a target? As she returned to the lounge, she overheard Colonel Bantry speaking to Mrs. McGillicuddy. "That artist's trouble," he muttered. "Too emotional, always sketching. Men like that can't be trusted." Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling a young man in her village whose passion for art had masked a harmless heart. But Felix, she sensed, was entangled in something more complex. She thought of the man in the dark coat, John Blackwood, whose bold handwriting linked him to the threats. Was he the mastermind, or a pawn in a larger game? As the evening drew to a close, Miss Marple retired to her room, her knitting tucked under her arm. The artist's secret, she knew, was a thread in the tapestry of murder, but it was not the only one. Fortescue's desperation, Elsie's fear, the Colonel's unease, all were strands, woven by a hand that was both cunning and careless. In St. Mary Mead, a lovesick boy had once stolen to impress a girl, only to be caught by his own recklessness. Here the stakes were higher, but the human heart, with its frailties and desires, was the same. Miss Marple's needles would wait, but her mind was already picking at the next knot in the mystery. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. The 6th day at the Seaside Hotel was marked by a restless unease, as if the very air carried the weight of secrets about to break. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the lounge with her knitting, felt the tension coiling tighter among the guests. The second tragedy, Elsie's near-fatal encounter with cyanide, had shattered any lingering pretense of normalcy, and the police presence, led by Inspector Craddock, was now a constant shadow. Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing, the way hands trembled, voices faltered, and glances darted. The killer, she sensed, was growing desperate, and desperation, she knew, often led to mistakes. The morning brought news from Craddock, who sought Miss Marple in the conservatory, where she was examining a wilting fern. "We've found John Blackwood," he said, his voice low but urgent. "He was hiding in a boarding house 10 miles away. He's being brought here for questioning. His handwriting matches the threatening letter you found, and he admits to knowing Mrs. Laurent through her late husband's business dealings. Claims he's no killer, but his story's shaky." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing. "A man on the run often has something to hide, Inspector," she said. "But whether it's murder or something else remains to be seen." Craddock's eyes narrowed. "You think he's a distraction?" Miss Marple's smile was faint. "I think, Inspector, that a clever killer might use a man like Blackwood as a scapegoat. You might ask him about his movements the night of Mrs. Laurent's death, and whether he saw anyone near the hotel's service entrance." Craddock made a note, his respect for her instincts clear. "I'll press him hard," he said. "And I've got men searching the grounds again. There's talk of a discarded coat near the cliffs. Might be a clue." The mention of the coat piqued Miss Marple's interest. She recalled Miss Prescott's gossip about a man in a dark coat, and the porter's glance at the station. Returning to the lounge, she found Mrs. McGillicuddy in a state of agitation. "Jane, the gardener found something odd," she whispered. "A coat, hidden in the bushes near the cliff path. The police have it now." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "How curious," she said. "Did he say anything else?" Mrs. McGillicuddy shook her head. "Only that it was heavy, as if something was in the pocket." That afternoon, Craddock shared his findings. The coat, a dark wool overcoat, contained a small vial, empty but reeking of cyanide. More startling was the label inside. Initials F.W. stitched in neat thread. Felix Warrender. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, felt a pang of disappointment. Not in Felix, but in the killer's attempt to frame him. It was too obvious, she thought, like a poorly written novel. Craddock, however, was energized. "We're bringing Warrender in now," he said. "If those are his initials, he's got explaining to do." Felix was summoned to the library, his face pale as he faced Craddock's questions. Miss Marple, permitted to observe, sat unobtrusively in a corner, her needles a soft counterpoint to the tension. "That's not my coat," Felix insisted, his voice cracking. "I lost mine days ago. It was stolen from my room. Someone's trying to pin this on me." His eyes, wide with fear, darted to Miss Marple, as if pleading for her to believe him. "I loved Vivian," he blurted. "I'd never hurt her. But someone knew. Someone used my feelings to make me look guilty." Craddock pressed him about his relationship with Mrs. Laurent. Felix admitted to a brief romance in London, cut short when she grew distant. "She was afraid," he said, his voice low. "She told me someone was watching her, threatening her. I thought she meant Blackwood." Miss Marple's needles paused. Felix's confession, though emotional, rang true, but it also painted him as a convenient suspect. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead, where a spurned lover had been framed for theft by a cunning rival. The pattern here was similar, but deadlier. Leaving the library, Miss Marple sought out Elsie, who was recovering in her room under a constable's watch. The girl, still frail, clutched a handkerchief as Miss Marple sat beside her. "Elsie, my dear," she said gently, "you mentioned a man who threatened you. Can you recall anything more about that?" "Note!" Elsie's eyes filled with tears. "It was his writing, miss. Bold, like he was angry. And he knew things about my brother, his troubles. Said he'd ruin us if I didn't obey." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind turning to the bold handwriting of the letter she had found. It was a link, but to whom? Back in the lounge, the guests were on edge. Colonel Bantry, his bluster subdued, avoided Felix, as if fearing guilt by association. Miss Prescott, her notebook open, scribbled furiously, her eyes darting to Mr. Fortescue, who stood by the bar, his face ashen. Miss Marple, settling into her chair, decided to test a theory. "Mr. Fortescue," she said, her voice mild, "you must have known Mrs. Laurent's habits well, managing such a fine hotel. Did you ever notice her meeting anyone unusual?" Fortescue started, his glass clinking against the bar. I hardly knew her," he stammered. "She was a guest, nothing more." But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with panic. The room fell silent as Craddock entered, his expression grim. "Mr. Fortescue," he said, "we need to speak, now." Fortescue's composure shattered. He bolted for the door, only to be stopped by two constables. The guests gasped, and Miss Prescott's pen froze mid-word. Miss Marple, her knitting steady, watched as Fortescue was led away, his protests echoing down the hall. She thought of the coat, the vial, the handwriting. The net was tightening, but the true motive, she sensed, was still hidden. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked the cliff path, the wind sharp against her face. The unravelling had begun, but the killer's design was not yet clear. Fortescue's panic suggested guilt, but was he the mastermind or a pawn? Felix's confession, Elsie's fear, Blackwood's flight, all were threads in a complex weave. In St. Mary Mead, a greedy shopkeeper had once framed a rival to save his business, only to be undone by a careless detail. Here, the stakes were higher, but the human frailties, greed, fear, love, were the same. Miss Marple's step was light as she returned to the hotel, her mind poised to pull the final thread. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. The 7th day at the Seaside Hotel dawned with a brittle clarity, the sea sparkling under a rare winter sun. The guests, gathered in the drawing room, were subdued, their faces etched with the strain of a week marked by death and suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, sensed the moment of reckoning had arrived. The arrest of Mr. Percival Fortescue the previous evening had sent ripples through the hotel, but Miss Marple knew the truth was a tapestry, woven from many threads, and only now were the final stitches falling into place. Inspector Craddock, his expression resolute, had called the guests together, insisting Miss Marple join them. "You've seen more than most, Miss Marple," he said quietly as they entered the drawing room. "I'd value your perspective when we lay this out." She nodded, her eyes serene but alert, her knitting needles still for once. The room was heavy with anticipation. Colonel Bantry sat stiffly, his hands clasped. Miss Lydia Prescott, her notebook abandoned, watched with bated breath. Felix Warrender, cleared of suspicion but still shaken, hovered near the window. And Mrs. McGillicuddy, ever loyal, sat beside Miss Marple, her face a mix of dread and excitement. Craddock stood before the fireplace, his voice steady. "We've uncovered the truth behind Mrs. Laurent's murder and the attempt on Elsie's life," he began. "Thanks to Miss Marple's keen eye, we've pieced together a motive and a method." He gestured to her, and all eyes turned. Miss Marple, her demeanour calm, set her knitting aside and rose, her small figure commanding the room's attention. "It began with greed," she said, her voice clear and measured. "Mrs. Laurent was a wealthy woman, her fortune a temptation to someone in desperate need. Mr. Fortescue, as we learned, was drowning in debt, the hotel teetering on ruin. He saw in Mrs. Laurent not just a guest, but a solution." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. But she was not easily swayed. She refused his requests for a loan, and so he turned to darker means. Miss Marple recounted the threatening letter she had found, its bold handwriting matching the hotel ledgers signed by Fortescue. "He wrote to frighten her," she said, hoping to drive her away or force her compliance. When that failed, he used cyanide, obtained through an old chemist contact from his days in London, to poison her cocoa. Elsie, poor girl, was coerced with threats against her family, her fear making her an unwilling accomplice. The note she burned was in Fortescue's hand, not John Blackwood's. Craddock nodded, taking up the thread. Blackwood was a convenient scapegoat. He'd worked with Mrs. Laurent's late husband, extorting money through shady deals. Fortescue, knowing this, invited him to the hotel, planting the coat with Felix Warrender's initials to shift suspicion. The vial in the pantry, meant to kill Elsie and silence her, was a miscalculation. Her survival exposed Fortescue's plan. Felix, his face pale, spoke up. "But why frame me?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Your affection for Mrs. Laurent was no secret, Mr. Warrender. Fortescue saw it, used it. A young man in love is an easy target for suspicion." Felix flushed, looking away. Colonel Bantry, his voice gruff, muttered, "Damned coward, using a boy's feelings like that." Miss Prescott, chastened, said nothing, her usual gossip silenced by the weight of truth. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. "The coat was a clumsy touch, too obvious. Fortescue underestimated Elsie's resilience and the clarity of small details, the handwriting, the staff's fear, his own nervousness. In my village, a greedy man once betrayed himself by overreaching. Here, it was the same. She sat, her hands folding over her knitting, as Craddock outlined the evidence. Fortescue's confession, extracted under pressure, confirmed he had orchestrated both crimes, driven by desperation to save his hotel. As Fortescue was led away in handcuffs, the guests dispersed, their relief tempered by exhaustion. Colonel Bantry shook Miss Marple's hand, his respect clear. "You've a mind like a steel trap," he said. Miss Prescott, subdued, vowed to curb her gossip, though Miss Marple doubted the promise would hold. Felix, his shoulders lighter, thanked her quietly. "I thought I'd lost everything," he said. She smiled. "The heart recovers, Mr. Warrender. Give it time." Later, as Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy packed for their return to St. Mary Mead, her friend marvelled. "Jane, how do you see it all? It's like magic." Miss Marple chuckled, her needles clicking once more. "No magic, Elspeth. Just people. Being people. They're much the same everywhere, if you watch closely." As the train pulled away from St. Mary's Bay, the Seaside Hotel fading into the mist, Miss Marple gazed at the sea, her mind already turning to the quiet mysteries of home.